the synapse. So we kind of started going off there a little bit, but let's look at some specific chemicals, that affect the synapse. Clostridium Botulinum Toxin. So there's a nasty bacterium out there called Clostridium Botulinum. What disease does it cause?
Botulism.
Botulism, not too hard to figure out. The reason it causes botulism is that the toxin that it produces joins with the presynaptic membranes of certain neurons and stops the release of acetylcholine. Okay, so it stops the release of acetylcholine. Well, if you can't release acetylcholine, you can't make certain neurons fire, or in the case of muscles, you can't make the muscles contract, because acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, the neuromuscular transmitter. Botulism toxin, incredibly toxic. Right? It's estimated that 1 pound of botulism toxin, think about a pound of hamburger for a minute, we're not talking much. Okay? 1 pound of botulism toxin, if appropriately distributed, would kill all 7 billion humans on planet Earth. 1 pound. Incredibly strong toxin, right? Incredibly strong. Luckily for us, this toxin is not found that often in nature. The bacterium is an anaerobe. Those of you that have micro or had micro, or just in general, you know that means it grows in anaerobic conditions when there's not enough oxygen, right? And so somewhere, your parents taught you, if you have a canned good that is all puffed up, feed it to somebody you don't like. No. They said, don't eat that, right? Because that means that anaerobes have been growing inside that can. Classic case maybe would be your grandma calls you up to complain that you're never coming to see her because you're taking that nasty physiology class and the instructor makes you study all the time. And she said, why don't you just come over for a few minutes on Sunday and I'll make you my special green bean salad that you like. Right? So you go over to see Granny. She picks her own green beans, cans her own green beans. Now Granny's getting a little bit old. She's maybe not so good on the canning anymore. She goes into her pantry, pulls out the green beans. She notices that the lid is puffed up, but she says, oh, they'll be okay. I made these myself. Right? So she pours you out your nice green beans. You have your green bean salad, nice visit with Granny. You go home that night. You start getting very ill, right? Vomiting, right? You're quite ill, you're sick. And maybe the next morning you wake up dead. Right? Because Granny's green beans had botulism toxin. Right? Now, if she would have cooked the green beans before she served them to you, it turns out botulism toxin is quite heat labile. It breaks down with heat. But she didn't, right? It was a nice cold green bean salad. If you went to the hospital and you were lucky enough for them to figure out that you had botulism, it turns out there is an antitoxin that they could give you to save your life. Somewhere you've learned that you're not supposed to feed infants raw honey, right? Hopefully you know this, right? You need to pasteurize the honey. It turns out that botulism toxin can actually grow in honey, and for some reason that we don't understand very well, infants don't have the ability to stop that bacterial growth, and they'll actually produce enough toxin in their intestines that they get botulism. I had a student quite a few years ago whose young daughter ended up with botulism. He took her to the hospital, community hospital recognized it, they gave her the antitoxin, saved her life. All right, so the question came up earlier, somebody talked about Botox, right? So you know that Botox is being used cosmetically. Initially, this toxin, Botox, once they figured this out, that it could stop the release of acetylcholine, they used it initially to primarily treat young children that had very strong spasms of their necks. And so they would inject a very dilute amount of botulism toxin into their necks, and it allowed them to relax their necks and hold their heads up. If you dilute this toxin, very, 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 very dilute, you can inject it into muscles, and it stops the release of acetylcholine, so the muscles do not contract. And so you know that commonly now, people go in for treatments with Botox. They inject it into the muscles, particularly around the eye, sometimes around the mouth. It causes those muscles to relax, and so the wrinkles disappear. right? So you don't have this wrinkle. Over time, a period of 3, 4, 5 months, the toxin's broken down by the body, you have to go back and get the new injections. I read an article, it's been quite a while ago, but a movie director was complaining that the young actresses that he was working with, and middle-aged actresses, could no longer show nice expressions on their face. They couldn't act anymore because they were all receiving Botox, right? So the grimaces and smiles and things that you expect to see in a face, they weren't occurring. Pretty interesting. Okay, another nasty bacterium, one called Clostridium Tetani. Okay, Clostridium Tetani. What disease does it cause? Tetanus, right? So this is a bacterium that can commonly be found associated with urine and feces, for instance, in a stockyard. If this toxin gets into you, it stops the release of GABA and glycine, and as a consequence, you will not have inhibitory transmitters being released that you should, right? And your excitatory impulses will be firing, and you will end up possibly, we hope not, but looking like that, right? So the excitatory neurons are firing, inhibitory transmitters are not being released, and so the person has lockjaw, right? Hopefully you've been vaccinated already, and there's antitoxins that we can use. Caffeine. Caffeine, a favorite drug of many people, right, actually does both things. It increases the release of excitatory transmitters and decreases the release of inhibitory transmitters, and gives you the effect that you see from caffeine. Anesthetics work in multiple ways. A general anesthetic usually works, so these general anesthetics usually work by increasing the movement of chloride ion into your neurons. Does that make sense, that would make you go to sleep? Increases the movement of chloride ion into neurons. Right? So it takes away consciousness because you go to sleep, right? You're inhibiting all the neurons at once. Local anesthetics, like your dentist is using, lidocaine or lidocaine-like drugs, block sodium channels. Okay? So they give you a shot into the area that they want to numb. That drug blocks the sodium channels, no depolarization. Right? So the dentist can now work away on your tooth, no impulses are being sent to the brain, and so you don't have any pain, because pain's not out here, right? Pain is in your brain.
So it increases the movement of chloride what?
Chloride ion. Strychnine increases the binding of inhibitory transmitters. Okay? Increases the binding. So Clostridium Tetani increases the release. Strychnine increases the binding of inhibitory transmitters. Causes spastic paralysis and death. Not a very pleasant way to die. And then psychotropic drugs. So I kind of went off on this a little bit already when we were talking about hallucinations, but drugs that affect the brain and cause changes in the view of reality are working by affecting transmitters. So whether it's lysergic acid, LSD, or cannabinoids, whatever the drugs, they're affecting the synapses and changing the behavior of the person, changing the reality, right, of what you experience. Let's stop there. Close it out.